Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Shane and I'm delighted to be joined by Bill Ayres, MVP, MCM, MCT, Flow Simulation Limited UK, who will be talking to you today about building solutions for Teams, SharePoint and Office with the SharePoint Framework. Remember to join the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC21. Don't forget to check out the Resource Center. This is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit SharePointEurope.com and click the content link at the top. ESPC 21 Online will take place on the 1st and 2nd of June 2021. To be a part of this event, simply register today for free. We also just announced our program, which includes a session by Bill Ayres. Visit SharePointEurope.com for the full program. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you have in the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Center, where you'll be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our webinar presenter, Bill Ayres. Hello, Bill.
Hi, Shane. How are you?
I'm great. I can hear you and your screen is just coming up. So take it away.
Thanks, Shane. Welcome, everybody, and welcome to this talk on building solutions for Teams, SharePoint, and Office with the SharePoint Framework. Hello, I'm Bill Ayres. I'm a consultant based in the UK. I say based in, like I'm here all the time. It's not like I go anywhere else at the moment, like most people. And I'm spending a lot of each day in Outlook and SharePoint and Teams, especially Teams, like a lot of people nowadays. So if you want to build solutions that people will actually use, you need to deliver them to users without them needing to switch context. And that's the idea behind this talk, which is how to extend all of those products, but by building custom solutions and specifically with the SharePoint framework. And we've only got about 40 minutes, so it's going to be a pretty high level overview. Right, the intelligent intranet. This is a bit of a marketing slide, but it's all about empowering users to find things, collaborate, and share knowledge. And it's easy to say, but in order to get this to work, these experiences need to be simple so that anyone can create content, simple for IT to manage. They have to be accessible, so not only inclusive for people with accessibility needs, specific accessibility needs, but also people wherever they're using it on any device. It's not just about people with disabilities, although that's very important, but everybody has accessibility requirements at some time in their life. It's got to be secure so that organizations can protect sensitive information and stay compliant with regulatory rules and so on. It needs to be integrated, bringing content and services from across the organization, surfacing any solutions you build, not only in a web browser, but right inside the apps that people are using in their daily work. And intelligent, so we're reaching the point where we're generating so much data every day. It's more than you can keep track of in your head. And so we need techniques like search and artificial intelligence really that'll go out on our behalf and find things and present them to us. So rather than us searching for things, it will say, you might be interested in this. And that's what we're going to see in some of the newer tools like Viva product range that's coming in, that's going to bring us that sort of AI tooling. And finally, extensible. So this is what we're talking about today, really, which is we can use that to create solutions to solve real business problems, because however good the platform that somebody like Microsoft builds, the businesses and organizations all have their unique requirements. The devil's really in the details. So there's always going to be a need to come up with custom solutions. So that's the idea behind these models. development models. Now, of course, behind everything, I've been doing SharePoint for many years, about, well, getting on for nearly, I guess, since 2003. So SharePoint is kind of at the heart of my my development journey over the last couple of decades, and it's also at the heart of all of these Microsoft 365 solutions. So it's kind of the foundation of the modern intranet. You can create all of these experiences with SharePoint, which itself has changed a lot even over about the last 5 years. It's much more modern, it's fast, it's beautiful to look at, it has native mobile support. So it's SharePoint is what's under there that gives you access to files and news and pages and apps and lists. You know, this great new innovation, lists is all SharePoint, and OneDrive is, of course, really SharePoint. So a lot of what underlies Microsoft 365 is the SharePoint platform. Now, a lot of the time, it's hidden behind Teams because, of course, Microsoft Teams has been the absolute star. It was already going crazy and meteorically successful even before coronavirus. Now it's become the means, really, that many people are able to continue to work while not being able to be physically present in the office. And Office, of course, SharePoint, Teams, and Office, we need to extend them with our custom solutions, but SharePoint's really the key to everything. Now, this is a sort of an architecture of the whole of Microsoft 365 as a platform at a very, very high level. So client applications are crucial because that's where people are spending all their time. In Office, Word, Excel, Outlook, PowerPoint even, and they have both web and native clients, and we need to be able to extend those with things like the Office add-ins, for example, with the Teams extensions. And the problem we've got is, you know, we need to be able to support that whichever platform they're running on. So some of the older technologies we use to extend these applications were dependent on really running on Windows, and we're now in a world where people are bringing their own devices and want to run those on mobile platforms. So we kind of had to come up with another way of building extensions compared to what we used to do many years ago, where we'd build things server-side using technologies like ASP.NET. That doesn't really work in this very mobile, multi-platform world. We need to come up with a different solution. And so what we've ended up using is web technologies. So, but it's been a real challenge over the last decade or so as to how can we do custom development, and how to increase our focus on web technology, which has been at times a slightly painful journey with perhaps a few false starts in our development technologies. But we've finally sort of come up with the way of building cross-platform extensions. So there are many native libraries to help with supporting that as well. So the intelligent cloud is really the one surface, API surface, that covers all the information stored in Microsoft 365 and underpinned, of course, by the identity platform, and exposed as a very well organized REST API that we call the Microsoft Graph. A graph, because it's not just table data, it's not hierarchical, it's much richer than that. It's a complex set of interconnected nodes, as the diagram sort of shows, but it's designed to be easy to navigate. So you can move from one node to another, pivot around things, find your way around all this complex data. And that's possible even if the underlying APIs that lie, or applications that lie behind these, have been written by different people, sometimes with different versions of technologies, sometimes even different technologies. Microsoft Graph brings all that together and gives us a modern standards-based platform that we can build great business applications on top of, either as an ISV, building solutions to sell, or more likely, I think, as a line of business solution where we're trying to solve the specific problems in our own organization. So the idea is that the platform also covers concerns such as authentication and authorization in a very consistent way. So bringing all this together gives us as developers a way of working with Microsoft 365 data right where users need it in the applications that they're spending all their time in. They don't have to switch apps. They don't have to leave Teams and go to some website to do something. It's all right there where they need it. And that increases productivity in a very measurable way. And to achieve all this, this modern development solution, you might think, oh, they must have come up with a new Visual Studio development environment, or maybe there's some super powerful Power Apps platform, but we've actually kind of gone back to the command prompt, and which is a surprising thing to quite a few people. So just hold that thought, we'll come back to it. But let's say we've identified a business problem we want to solve. We've done our due diligence. We've looked for a package solution. Of course, we're familiar with no-code options like Power Apps and Power Automate. They don't quite get us where we need to be. And to be honest, that kind of suits us, doesn't it? Well, if we're developers, right, we want to write code because that's what we do. So we need to extend these canvases. And so how you approach this, or your viewpoint, is going to vary depending on what your development background is. So I started as a child using Meccano as a sort of construction set. Forgive me, this is a bit of a complex analogy, but work with me. Quite fiddly nuts and bolts and quite tricky to do. But you could build quite complex mechanisms like gearboxes and things. And I feel as though that's a little bit, by analogy, also what we did as, in my case, from a sort of enterprise development background, using things like the ASP.NET platform, before that, building on top of Unix platforms. And then, if you've come from that world, then you probably don't particularly like JavaScript, and a lot of people don't. You may have then moved into SharePoint development like I did. And, we saw JavaScript as a bit of a tool for fixing things up in web pages. And I admit myself, I probably in the sort of around about 2010, or perhaps a bit earlier, 2007, I hadn't really appreciated JavaScript as quite a well thought out language, with a few pretty important flaws, admittedly, but as a language in its own right, because we only really used bits of that language, and we didn't probably use it terribly well at the time. But that's the sort of, that's the world that we came from. If, on the other hand, you come from the sort of front-end developer background, then you're probably very comfortable with JavaScript and you've been using it a lot. And that's my analogy there, is the Lego set. So later, when I was a bit older, which is sort of the other way around, I kind of moved to using Lego sets, and they click together really easily, and you can build things quickly, but they're not as complex. You can't build a complex engineering solution with it. And I feel as though that's a little bit like front-end development used to be. That was the user interface changes. You want to get a button to quickly do something, you might do it in the front end in JavaScript, and it was seen as a little bit of a hack, whereas on the back end, where the sort of serious developers building this enterprise solution. So if your perspective is from front-end development, you're probably already very comfortable with a lot of the tooling that goes around JavaScript and client-side development. Now, bear with me. We've kind of got a new solution now, which is the best of both worlds, which is the, I kind of think of as being a little bit like Lego Technic, in that we're doing JavaScript development, client-side development, using TypeScript, which gives us some of the newer features which are coming into the JavaScript language over time as well. But it gives us the option to build things like classes. Okay, whether you think that's a good idea in JavaScript, which has its own inheritance model, is another debate. But it feels more like C# or like a classical language like Java, rather than JavaScript, which uses a different inheritance model that not so many people are familiar with. And so TypeScript kind of gets around some of that, and there are tools like React.js as well, which is a very powerful view rendering library, which allows us to build really quite robust and well-engineered client-side code, which is a world away from the JavaScript code that we were writing in 2010. It's good quality code, and so I feel as though that's like the Lego Technic approach, that is quick to assemble, but also we can build very complex, properly engineered solutions in it. Now, forgive me, I hope you'll forgive this. If you're a Power Platform enthusiast, you'll forgive this analogy, but the Power Platform feels a little bit like the sort of the Duplo set in the sense that, you know, you get a train and it's a train, and yeah, you can change the cab off and put a different cab on, but you can do what the platform has been designed to do, and if you need to go beyond that, then it becomes it's more difficult to come up with a more complex solution, and yeah, I think that's the trade-off you make. And you need to make sure that, you know, can I build it with the Power Platform before I start building my complex custom solution? And you know, there are many great things about the Power Platform, but it isn't quite at the point where it's something that, you know, when you need the very, very detailed requirements you have to satisfy, you can't always get there with the Power Platform. But there's an interesting fact, is that Lego and Duplo bricks are actually compatible. You can use them together. They plug, the way they've designed them, the tubes in the bottom of the Lego bricks fit into those holes in the studs of the Duplo bricks. So you can actually combine Power Platform, like Power Automate and Power Apps with some of this custom code as well. So the two things can kind of work together as well. And so, you know, that's particularly if you've got small children, that's probably the big takeaway from this talk, is that, you know, you can use these things can work together. So in some cases, you might build something that augments what then a power user or a citizen developer can use with the Power Platform. So extending SharePoint or Teams or Office, what we're really doing is we're extending the canvas. So on this slide here, I've got documents, conversations, and pages. The documents represent what you'd have in, say, Word or Excel, you know, these Office applications. The conversations really pertain to Teams, which is mainly a conversational type of user interface. The pages are our SharePoint intranet pages. They might render in Teams, Teams tabs, which can render pages as well, but you can get at your SharePoint site that's behind your Teams team. But so those are really what documents, conversations, and pages refer to, and they've all got their canvases. And so what we do when we extend these platforms is platforms isn't the right word, these applications, is we have a manifest file, and the manifest file is really the main thing it does is it says, here's what my extension does, here's where it plugs into Teams or SharePoint or Office or whatever it is, and then this is where I want you to go, and I've got a web application or perhaps a web service somewhere hosted on the internet that's accessible, and and that is what wires it all together. And then that, in the case of the, let's just lay aside bots and messaging extensions, which are kind of web service solutions, but where we're rendering something on the client, then that gets rendered into the canvas inside, whichever application it is. So it could be a Teams tab, or it could be a SharePoint page and a web part inside of a SharePoint page, or it could be a task pane extension as an Office add-in. But it's the same idea that underlies it all. There's a manifest file that wires these things together, and there are SharePoint manifest files, and there are Teams manifest files, and there are Office add-in manifest files, and they're all written in JSON, except for the Office add-ins, which are XML files. But it's the same idea. It's just wiring these things together. So the consequence of that is that you can really use any technology you like for the sort of the web part of it. So if you're, and typically this is the case if you're building on top of Microsoft technologies, you're probably using ASP.NET. If you come from that background, that's fine. You can use that to host whatever your web application or web service is. But if you want to use Node.js, which I tend to do, you can use that as well, and then you can have everything in JavaScript, both front end and client side and server side. Or you could use heaven help us PHP if you if that was your choice of web development platform. You could use PHP, or even just static sites. You don't have any back end technology at all. You do it all client side, and you're just serving JavaScript pages and HTML pages and CSS files, and so you could use a static site or a CDN as another way of doing it. In some cases, you can just use this content delivery network to deliver whatever assets you need to make available to render in this canvas inside one of these applications. So a lot of the build tools for this, the tool chain is based on top of Node.js, and this supports tools like Yeoman and NPM and Gulp, for example. Many of these tools will be familiar if you've come from the Lego background, the web development background. If you've come from the Meccano, the ASP.NET developer, then they might not be so familiar with you, and you might have a few things to learn. But they're pretty easy, I think, once you get your head around what's going on, and you get used to going back to the command prompt, which is where a lot of these are run from, rather than in an IDE, like an integrated development environment like Visual Studio. We spend a lot of time in Visual Studio Code, which is not presented as an IDE, although it is really by the time you've got all these add-ins for it. It is pretty close to what you get with Visual Studio. So that's our Lego Technic sort of development tool chain. So one of the things that's really, in terms of the Microsoft technology stack, has sort of really promoted this idea of this modern web development tool chain and how we can use it for client-side development is the SharePoint Framework. Now, when we've been through a few iterations in SharePoint development, we started with the sort of server-side code, full trust code, and then we went to the sandbox. So those of you who've been doing this for a while will remember, which was sort of a way of trying to get things to run in some way that could then be done in a cloud environment. That was a main objective of the sandbox. Then that didn't really work, so we went to the add-in model. And add-ins kind of started us on the journey to doing client-side development. So I think although they're still available, we don't tend to use add-ins, SharePoint add-ins. SharePoint Framework is now the recommended approach for doing SharePoint development. But the add-ins kind of got us into client-side development and having the REST APIs that we could use to do client-side development and still talk back to SharePoint on the back end, which now, the Microsoft Graph is probably the preferred REST API, although the SharePoint ones are still there. But the Microsoft Graph is probably the way to go moving forward as our API surface to talk to the back end of SharePoint and Microsoft 365 generally. So the SharePoint framework is really been around for about, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago we started using this, and it's using a lot of these modern development tools built on top of Node.js, and you can then use client-side libraries, whichever ones you want to. The recommended one is probably, well, I'm going to say the recommended client-side view rendering library is React, because there are many tools for building the user interface using React components. So if that's, if you've got a choice of which approach to take to client-side development, I would recommend going down the React route, unless you're already, say, an Angular developer or a Vue developer, and you're already very familiar. Then you can still use those tools and still use those SPA frameworks to do your client-side development. But other things being equal, if you have no particular commitment already, then I would suggest that React is the way to go. And one of the big things about this approach is that it's apart from that, it's not just for SharePoint, but it's what Microsoft are building SharePoint with. So we're using the same technologies that Microsoft are using to build SharePoint, and that wasn't always quite true in, say, 10 years ago when we were building solutions on SharePoint. There would be the sort of the APIs that we got to use, and there'd be behind the scenes, for the product itself, they'd use a slightly different set of tools or have some additional tools that they could use. Now they're using these same tools as we are. So that has definitely improved the quality of the development tooling around SharePoint. And it's not just code, there's a whole package, there's a build process, there are deployment tools, there's a content delivery network, CDN, that's built into SharePoint that you can take advantage of as well to deploy the assets. And surprisingly, for people who've been doing Microsoft development for a long time, it doesn't all revolve around Visual Studio. It's really, you can use any code editor you like, but Visual Studio Code is the kind of web editor of choice, because not just for people building for the SharePoint framework, in the web development world generally, a lot of people are using Visual Studio Code. It's become very popular because it's just a good code editor, and we'll see it in a few minutes if you're not familiar with it. Along with open source tooling like these Yeoman templates, which does the job that you might do in Visual Studio with file new projects, for example, and these various build tools, package management tools, and so on, all built on top of Node.js, which also acts as the web server and as a sort of the sort of surface on which all these tools are built, which makes it cross-platform, which is a nice thing as well. So you don't have to be using a Windows machine to use it all. Once you've got Node installed, then as long as you can get Node running, you can use any machine or platform that you want to do this. So let's just see what it looks like. Apologies if you've seen this 100 times before, but this is just building a Microsoft a SharePoint framework solution. So we do Yo is just short for Yeoman, which is this scaffolding tool. You only really need to use that at the beginning of a project to set something up, and we give it a name, tell it where we want to put it. We get this delightful bit of ASCII art as well, which is also takes you back if you're old enough to have been doing development in the 1980s. And we give it a name, and we'll call this facilitate. And now we get to choose which development framework, and I've chosen React here, and I can't cover React in this talk, but you can find more at reactjs.org. And then immediately it's scaffolded out the solution, and that was done at the point where we got to the last of those creates in the list. And what it's doing now is it's going through and resolving all the dependencies using the npm package manager. So that's doing equivalent would be NuGet if you're in Visual Studio, for example. So I speeded that up. Actually takes a little bit longer than you saw that. I speeded that up to save time. So once we've built that, we can then open Visual Studio Code. This is Visual Studio Code. If you're not familiar with that, if you've been in Visual Studio for the and it's actually based on web technology. So the user interface of Visual Studio Code is actually also using web technologies. And then what we've just very quickly looking at the code structure. It's not really a project. It's just a folder. And then we run something called gulp serve. So that's that gulp tool, which is a build tool, which goes and builds everything. And then it serves a test page, which is this one. So if you look at the URL, you can see it's localhost port 4321. So it's just running on my local machine. So it's a fake SharePoint page or a fake SharePoint online page. It's not really running anywhere. It can be just running locally. So I don't need an internet connection to do the development at this stage. So I could do it on a plane. Not likely to be happening anytime soon. And so what that is a SharePoint web part rendered in this sort of local development framework. So you can look at the code behind this. So this is actually JavaScript, except it's TypeScript, which is a superset of JavaScript that compiles down to JavaScript. And this is actually a file that's going to be run through a JSX compiler to make React work. And what I was just highlighting there was where it's retrieving a file, an image file from, actually, in this case, we're using an Azure storage account to get that data from, but they could just as well be using, say, a SharePoint list or something like that to retrieve that from. I'm not sure why we didn't use SharePoint for this demo, but I guess it's easier to set up. And then I get a list of items. So this is a facilities management sample. So we get a list of items. This .state is just a feature of React, and then we map all of those items and render them. And you can see here that it's doing a return, and it looks as though these look a bit like HTML elements, you'd think, maybe being returned, and yet there are no quotation marks around it. So if you're not familiar with React, this is a feature of the React compiler. It's going to go in here, it's going to translate those all into bits of JavaScript so that it renders correctly. So all this is actually going to be TypeScript. It's going to be JavaScript. It's going to be TypeScript, and then it's going to be JavaScript. And wherever we have these braces, then it's a bit like a templating engine, except what actually happens is that just gets rendered as a bit of JavaScript, which then gets compiled. So we get a table. Now, whenever you make a change to the source code, it automatically will rebuild and rerun the page. So it will then re-render it. So as you go through here making changes, we're going to make this a little bit prettier now by changing the way it renders using some of these. You see those elements, command bar, for example, and details list. Those obviously are not HTML elements. Those are coming from this library of React components. So the components are coming from Office UI Fabric React here. So these React components are pre-built, and the nice thing about that library is it looks like part of the platform. So it looks like part of a SharePoint page, and when we do Teams, it looks a bit like a Teams page. So that's blob. You see where it says it's coming from blob.core.windows.net. That's actually an Azure storage account that's retrieving these various elements, and there's an image coming from here as well. So document card preview again does a nice bit of formatting for us, so we don't have to work out all the details of formatting everything precisely. So I'm just going to switch the rendering method around to one that I've pre-written here, so you can see what that looks like. So once we save that change, it should re-render it. And then when we look at the page again, it's now formatted a bit more nicely with these greens and reds and yellow status indicators. And if I click on one of these, it should then show me the picture of the facility, which is the building that's for this building management solution. Okay, so that's a way of building on top of SharePoint using the SharePoint framework, in case you haven't seen that before. Now, when we look at Teams, we've got a lot of extensible extension points in Teams. So many, it sometimes gets a bit confusing about when to use which one. So we've got tabs, which are the ones that are going to be particularly of interest, which we'll talk about now. But there are also things like bots and messaging extensions, which will use a web service at the back end. Typically, that would be built with the Microsoft bot framework. I mean, theoretically, you could build it out using any technology again, but it's going to be a lot easier to use the bot framework. And then the various other things like that you can put things into the activity feed. You can have connectors which work across Microsoft 365. There are incoming and outgoing webhooks, various extension points you can use, but we'll focus on tabs. So tabs is by far the easiest way to extend Team. So a tab is just really an external web page rendered inside Teams. It can be in a team, in which case it's called a configurable tab, because it's something that you can then set up for that team if you're the team owner. And the other type is the personal tabs, which are really just for you. So they're that doesn't affect anybody else in the team. It's just your own way of getting at some sort of UI, which will be a web page effectively. But just for your own use. It's not visible to other people in the team. So again, there's just as with everything else that we've been talking about, there's a manifest file behind the scenes. There's a Teams manifest, and that's what points to the web content. So that could be just a page, a static page, or it could be something more complex with some interaction, perhaps using the Microsoft graph to interact with Microsoft 365, or it might be very app-like. You know, you could make it so it, make it look like a web page, or make it not look like a web page. Just make it look like an application where everything is running in JavaScript or TypeScript. So as before, you need to host that somewhere. And so one of the ways of developing a Teams tab or a tab in Teams is to, you say, I'm going to build this in either Node.js or ASP.NET, and then I can host it in Azure. But another option is to, and that kind of solves the problem of, I have to have an Azure account and set up Azure web apps and things, is to say, well, we've already got SharePoint, which serves pages. Can we just use that? And so there is a way of doing that, which is to simply have a web part that renders inside a team as a tab using the SharePoint framework. So this is a really nice option. It solves a couple of problems. It solves that hosting problem that I mentioned, and it also solves the sort of authentication and authorization problem, because you already have that authorization context that you have inside a SharePoint page, because you are effectively now inside a SharePoint page when you render this thing. So you can take advantage of all those capabilities as well. So particularly if you're a SharePoint developer already, this is the perfect solution for building a Teams tab. So we can bring that into Teams, and it might be that you want to make that a web part that I can use in a SharePoint site and in Teams as a tab, because you might have some functionality that makes sense in both of those places, or it might not. That's a decision you have to make. So you can either say, I want it to be visible in SharePoint, or I want it to be visible as a Teams tab or as a personal tab, or both, or three. You can make that decision, and it's just a very simple change in the manifest file. So let's just see what that looks like very quickly. It's got a few minutes, so what we're going to do is we're going to go into Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to go to the manifest file. This is the SharePoint manifest file, not the Teams manifest, the SharePoint manifest. And then you see there's a section here called supported hosts. And in fact, IntelliSense helps us here because we can see we can either have a Teams personal app or a Teams tab. That would be called a configurable tab and a static tab in the Teams manifest. It's a slight mismatch in the terminology. So we've added a Teams tab. So once you add that into the manifest file, then when you build that, so this is the normal packaging process, is to do a gulp build and then a gulp package. Sorry, gulp bundle ship we have to do first, which does all the sort of the Webpack, compressing everything into one big JavaScript file, and then the gulp bundle ship, sorry, gulp package solution ship. Then once I've done that, I can go into, I'll get in this SharePoint folder in my SharePoint Framework folder. I've got this, navigate to it, the SP package file. So this is the same deployment that we'd use with the web part, or even an add-in, SharePoint add-in would work the same way. It's the same packaging format. So I need to find my way to the SharePoint app catalog, which is sometimes a bit of a convoluted way. There's a few ways of getting there. Probably the easiest way is just to remember the URL. And then if I go to apps for SharePoint, this is where the magic happens, is if I take that SP package file and drop it onto the SharePoint app catalog, which remember is just a SharePoint list, but it's got a bit of behavior that it will, when I then, okay, it's just deploying it now. I do want to make sure that it's available to all sites in the organization, because that will make the deployment a lot easier. And then once you select it, if you go to the Files tab, there's this Sync to Teams icon in the ribbon, which lights up because I've got that setting in the in the manifest that said Teams tab. It knows, so it will deploy that. It's deployed it with a sort of a default Teams manifest, and now if I can then see it when I go to the Teams catalog, and I can then add it to a tab. So I'll do that now. So I can find it here. I've done this a few times, but we can find facilitate and add that to the page, or add that as a tab. This is just its configuration page. I'll save. And now that web part that we built and we saw in the SharePoint framework in SharePoint works pretty much the same inside a tab inside Teams. So we've and all of that is hosted in SharePoint. Now if I wanted to, I could also have a Teams manifest that had other things in if I needed to, in which case I would drop a manifest file into the SharePoint framework solution. Okay, so very, very quickly now, I just spent 5 minutes. We've done SharePoint and Teams. I'll just talk a little bit about Office. So one of the things about Office applications is you often find that you go to a business, they're growing rapidly. They've ended up with some ridiculous process where somebody comes in and there's a paper system with some, I don't know, some order numbers, and they transcribe them into another system, and then somebody else copies them into an Excel spreadsheet, and then just get these awful manual processes, and they're ripe for automating by doing something like building an Office add-in. So Office add-ins are really, everybody's using Office in business, so almost everybody. So it gives us a way of extending Office and building solutions for, we don't have time to really go into it in great detail here, but it's cross-platform, so it's using the same kinds of technology. In fact, there's a Yeoman generator for it as well, so we can use pretty much the same workflow that we used for building a SharePoint framework solution or a Teams extension for that matter. So what happens is, again, this is the canvas here, this time inside the Outlook client. And when you install an application like this one, which is called Email Reactor, and you can get that from the store if you're interested, that will have its own manifest file. As I think I mentioned, it's XML and not JSON, and like the other manifests we've been talking about. But again, it points to some hosting somewhere. And again, that can be any technology you like. It doesn't really matter. It could just be static pages, whatever you need. It will then get rendered into the canvas inside the Office application, and so you can extend Office that way. And there's a JavaScript library that then gives you access to the context that that's running in. So I can get at this document that I'm looking at, this email in this case. I can get at that. I can also use Microsoft Graph to get at permissions, provided I have sufficient permissions to all the data inside Microsoft 365 if I need to augment it in some way. So it's the very similar idea that you can build them in a few ways. There's a tool called Script Lab if you want to just experiment, which is like a meta add-in, which is an add-in for these Office applications that let you have a little editor so you can try this out. Not really suitable for production use. You'd probably want to use something like either Visual Studio or use the same tool chain that we've been using. So have a Yeoman generator and then use Visual Studio Code and work like that. Now there was an announcement at Build 2019, which is I got really excited about, which is that you can use SharePoint Framework, currently only available for Outlook and the web version, web application, to use the SharePoint Framework to build an add-in to work inside Outlook. So it's nearly up to Build 2021 in a few weeks. I would hoped that they would have done a bit more by now on this. I guess there's been COVID and other things to worry about over the last year and a bit. So I hope I think this is a great idea, and it would be really nice to see that rolled out across other Office clients and other versions of Outlook. We'll have to just see and wait for things to happen there. But this is an interesting direction, and I hope we see that that as a development platform we can use across not only SharePoint and Teams, but across the whole of the Office add-ins as well. So just a few quick design guidelines. So I would say, you could theoretically build a SharePoint framework web part that runs in SharePoint and Teams and Office Outlook as well. You probably doesn't make sense to build something that can work in all these three places because they're different types of users with different user interfaces. It probably makes more sense to design the thing you want in SharePoint and design the thing you want in Teams rather than try and make it all the same application. But having said that, there's a lot of opportunity for reusing some code and reusing your knowledge, because if you can use that same development approach for all these three places. But yeah, I would say the other things are really around, focusing on what you want the user to do. Don't try and do everything in one application that you're building. Give the users control. Just go easy on the branding. Some people go over the top on that, and it can detract from the user experience, who really aren't that interested in who wrote the application. And so they, as I say, they probably don't even know that it's an application. They just probably think it's part of the platform. It really doesn't matter. I mean, it's whatever works best for the user. So I wouldn't worry too much about branding it. And same with content. Go easy on the Chrome. It's the content that users are interested in. If you can make it so that users aren't aware that they're using your application, that's kind of a win, I think. Another thing you can do is give them a first run experience. So when they first install it, it comes up and says, here's what this application does. Here's what we can do for you. So that's sort of the general landing page for Microsoft documentation, and there's a set of learning resources at that URL, which I think still works. I didn't check it, but there's various learning paths that you can find on Microsoft Learn. But I would encourage you to sign up for the Microsoft 365 developer program. That's also at that URL, developer.microsoft.com. Dev.microsoft.com works as well. Try building some samples with Visual Studio Code, and you can use Visual Studio as well for a lot of these, but I would suggest Visual Studio Code, Node.js, Yeoman as your tool chain, and then just think about what kind of collaboration challenges you have in your organization and how you can unlock some of that business productivity by extending Microsoft Teams and SharePoint and Office. So thank you very much, and I think we've got time for a few questions.
Thanks for a great presentation, Bill. And now we will start the questions and answers part. And should you wish to ask a question, please type it into the questions window now. We've had no questions in so far, Bill, so that's actually a very good sign. Usually it's a case that you've been quite thorough on your explanations.
Oh, that's the way I'm looking at it, yeah.
and that's where we're at so far. So unless something comes in the next few seconds, Bill, we might wrap it up at that, if that's okay with you.
That's absolutely fine, yes.
Super.
I hope it's been useful for people anyway.
Absolutely. Okay, Bill, we might just leave it at that, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
I'll just return back to my screen. Bill, on behalf of the ESPC community, thank you for taking the time today to complete this webinar. We really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Bill. Okay, everybody, this is the end of the webinar for today. Don't forget to check out the incredible program for ESPC 21 online. See SharePointEurope.com for full details. Find this webinar and more at SharePointEurope.com/resource-center. Again, a big thank you to Bill Ayres, and thank you for joining us today. Take care and goodbye.